This is your second annual cannabis conference at a time when the markets are not exactly looking pretty these days. But I want to start by asking...
Well, for cannabis stocks.
For cannabis stocks, that's right.
You.
Cowen was one of the very first U.S. investment banks to build out a cannabis practice, which I would imagine at the time felt like a risky thing to do. Tell me a bit about why you were such a pioneer. Why did that happen?
Well, a lot of it started with this amazing research team that we have here, and honestly, the great partnership that the research team developed with our banking team and our distribution team. Really, we felt there was an opportunity to articulate a business case for the entire industry. And I think in the United States, we get sometimes conflated between the regulatory environment here and cannabis globally. And the reality is that the global growth of cannabis is still in its infancy, but it's tremendous. There's a tremendous opportunity. It's disruptive. And I think our job at Cowen is to be in the middle of the debate, the center of the debate on disruptive moves in this particular case, consumer, medical, right? It's going to be a huge driver for ESG. It already is. And so we need to be in a position where we can articulate that so that our investors can figure out how to make money on it.
A lot of other investment banks have said, you know what, we're not going to touch this space until something changes with legislation, whether it's the Safe Banking Act or even as far as full federal legalization. So how do you balance your work in this space with the fact that this is a drug that is still ultimately illegal at the federal level?
Well, I mean, we're limited in what we can do here in the United States. I mean, but we operate freely in jurisdictions where there's federal legislation that allows us to do so. Canada, Israel, Mexico, Colombia, Portugal. And there's real opportunity there for us to be able to look at these brands. These are going to be global brands. I know it's tough to say that or see that sometimes, when you're in the middle of a downdraft. But the companies that are being built today, many of them are going to be, not only pioneers, but they're going to be stalwarts in the agro-industrial complex, and in some cases the medical complex, and in the consumer complex for years to come. And we're in on the ground floor of that, and we're happy to be there.
Will it ever be legalized fully at the federal level?
Probably. I don't know. I think so. I think that at the end of the day, people recognize, a lot of legislators I've talked to recognize that cannabis as a therapeutic in particular is a wonderful alternative for pain management, anxiety management. And how that translates and the work that has to be done in order for people to understand the clinical efficacy of cannabis, that's taking some time, but it will get there eventually because, let's face it, there are other drugs of choice that are far more disruptive, and we need alternatives. And so cannabis, in many respects, both from a medical and a recreational standpoint, provides an alternative that's well tolerated and generally safe.
So investors are having a tough time seeing the opportunity right now, though it's been a really tough stretch for cannabis stocks. How has that affected your business in this sector?
We have to stay true to who we are. And again, this is a little bit like some of the internet stocks and the tech bubble at the end of the 90s. There was a limited supply of companies. If you wanted to be invested in cannabis last year, you might have had just a handful of names. Now you've got a bunch more. And usually when that happens, it's the age-old Adam Smith supply and demand, and there's been a reevaluation. But there's also been some more regulatory challenges, and I'd say commercialization challenges. This is still a business that, for all of its opportunity, is still in its infancy. And when you're talking about actually being, really starting in many instances from when you look at the supply chain from growing all the way through to consumption, there's just a lot that can go wrong in that. And I think a lot of people's business models were overly aggressive probably early on. But we've seen this movie before in other industries, and I think we've got to take a long view, which we do. The other thing I would say is really interesting is I think at this conference I use these as touchstones, like the caliber of investor and the depth of investor, meaning big capital players are here. I think in some instances they're still cannabis curious in the United States as people try to figure out how to get around it. That is going to be a sea change over the next few years. And I tell people, the first decision on cannabis for investors is, should I be in it or not? Not, is it cheap? And in almost every other industry, they can make relative value judgments. In this industry, they're like, well, it's not really a matter of price. It's a matter of whether or not I should even get involved. And I think as investors become more comfortable with the industry and that changes, you're going to see far less volatility and far more opportunity for real companies to emerge.